The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute 2022 Fellow Mustafa Santiago Ali.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you. It's a blessing to be on the Pamunkey and the Mattapanais land and to take this journey together as we begin to unpack systemic racism, policy, and also focus on how do we help to revitalize our most vulnerable communities? How do we become authentic, collaborative partners to make real change happen? You know, our series is going to be focusing on, the fight for environmental justice and climate justice in the 21st century is where our focus has to be. We understand that we see many of the challenges that are happening across our country, and we are blessed to have individuals who will take this journey with us. There will be folks who are in the creative arts. There are folks who are focusing on policy. There are individuals who are standing on the front lines every day to make real change happen. So thank you once again for joining us as we take this journey together. I'm incredibly blessed also, and I will introduce my brother, Dr. Sacoby Wilson, here in a moment. But I want to also make sure that we set the proper foundation, that we have the right framing as we move forward, and understanding the roles that policy can play to be transformational, or how policy has also unfortunately been used to have some very devastating effects in our most vulnerable communities, in African-American communities, and Latinx communities, and Asian and Pacific Islander communities, Indigenous brothers and sisters, and in lower wealth communities as well. So with that being said, we're gonna begin to take this journey with just a few images that might help us to better understand how we got to this moment in time. So I'm gonna ask them to bring the first slide forward. And we'll move to the next one. James Baldwin, an amazing, amazing writer, civil rights icon, and truth teller, once shared with us that if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. Unfortunately, far too often, there are injustices happening across our country that some just don't see and some don't want to see. To really understand this, to be able to unpack many of these uncomfortable truths, then we have to go back to the beginning so that we can make sure that we're making progress as we move forward together. Next slide. We have to go back to our Indigenous brothers and sisters' first sets of interactions with individuals who are coming from Europe and other locations to this country. And we understand that we removed our Indigenous brothers and sisters from their traditional lands. We took them away from their traditional foods. We did some other dynamics also by exposing them to some very deadly diseases in our sets of interactions with them. And you will see from the Trail of Tears to a number of other actions that were driven by policy. Let's hold on to that for a second. Driven by policy, removed folks from one part of the country to another part and place them in very dangerous situations, often in land that no one else was interested in at that time. And you see whether it is the Indian Removal Act or a number of other pieces of policy, how we began to place our indigenous brothers and sisters in some very dangerous situations. Let's move forward. We also understand that it was policy and sets of actions that justified bringing African peoples to this country and enslaving them. And we understand that we also, when we had these African brothers and sisters who were here, they were given some of the most dangerous jobs to do. And they were doing those jobs, of course, as we all know, as free labor. We also understand that they were stripped of culture. They were, once again, taken away from their traditional foods and often placed, whether on plantations or in other situations, once again, in very, very dangerous situations. Let's move forward. Now, it is not just our indigenous and African American brothers and sisters who have also had to deal with some of these situations. Our Chinese brothers and sisters also help to build our infrastructure. So many people have conversations right now about infrastructure. We hear it when we talk about the bipartisan infrastructure bill. We hear it when we're talking about Build Back Better and how these types of pieces of legislation and policy can actually help us to make real change happen. But our Chinese brothers and sisters helped to build the railroads across our country. And after their service was done, once again, we began to enact these policies that had very, very devastating effects to those communities, saying that you are no longer wanted, you are no longer needed, and that we will actually limit your access and ability to join the American family. And we highlighted here for you the Chinese Exclusion Act, and there are a number of other pieces that were in place to actually move our Chinese brothers and sisters into certain areas, and at the same time, to slow the flow of individuals coming to this country. Next slide. Now, of course, we have to also call out, when we're beginning to have a better understanding of some of the things that we will talk about around environmental racism, environmental injustice, and environmental equity, that the Jim Crow laws of our country played a critical role in putting together infrastructures in a negative way that really blocked progress for African Americans, that limited their ability to be able to move into certain spaces, to be able to build wealth, and a number of other dynamics that are necessary for us to be able to thrive in this country. So from the Jim Crow laws to Rosa Parks here, that many of you have seen that iconic photo before of her sitting on the bus and protesting against the very egregious behaviors that were going on at that time, to the lack of access to food establishments, to housing, and a number of other dynamics are all wrapped up in Jim Crowism and the ripples of that are still playing out today in many environmental justice communities across our country. Next slide. We wanted to highlight also for our Japanese brothers and sisters, just to bring forward the injustices that were also done through policy to these communities, as folks were actually rounded up and placed in internment camps, and the policies that were put in place to actually justify these types of sets of actions. Now you have to remember, when we're talking about our Japanese brothers and sisters, not only were they moved into these locations, but they were also stripped in many instances of their wealth and had long battles in trying to be able to reclaim many of the things that were taken away from them. And we will see these types of dynamics play out time and time again in different and similar forms and fashions when we look at communities who we often label as our most vulnerable communities, and also as we begin to unpack what sacrifice zones are and how they became to be. And I just call out Executive Order 9066 that President Roosevelt signed that gave justification to sets of actions against our Japanese brothers and sisters. Next slide. Now we have to also just call out, as we go through this series, you are going to see these connections that are going to be linked to a number of the different examples that we will see around this country, both on the negative side of the equation and how we move toward a very more positive set of actions. One of them is around redlining. And redlining plays out in some very, very devastating ways. You have your redlining situations where people, once again, are placed into certain areas and then not having the access to the resources that will actually allow them to be able to change the dynamics in their communities. Next slide. And one of the other actions that you will see brought up time and time again as we move through this series is actually restrictive covenants. Lots of people may not know much about them, but they happened across our country. And sometimes people think, well, restrictive covenants is for those who know something about it, think, well, those were just things that were going on in the South. It's not just the South. It was also in the North and in the Pacific Northwest and a number of other locations where we made sure that certain areas were only for white folks, for white brothers and sisters. And there were strict restrictions that literally stopped people of color, African Americans and others from being in certain areas. And as you can see on that second item that's there, it says no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. And it goes even deeper than that, but we wanted to just give you sort of a top line, and we will go deeper into each and every one of these items as we move throughout this series. Next slide. The last point that I want to bring forward for folks before we invite Dr. Wilson into the conversation is around zoning. You know, we have residential zoning, we have industrial zoning, we have commercial zoning. And one of the leaders in the environmental justice movement, Dr. Robert Bullard there, talks often about your zip code as a predictor of your health, as a predictor of your wealth, and as a predictor also of how long you might live. And it's interesting when you begin to unpack many of the facts, to look at the analyses that are done. You literally can move from one zip code to the next zip code, and people will live significantly longer in one and shorter than the other. And then you have to begin to take a look at whom are those individuals who are living in those respective sets of areas. And a lot of it goes back to our zoning practices, exclusionary zoning, and zoning that often will allow very toxic facilities to be located close by communities of color and lower wealth communities. Now we're going to transition, and I want to bring my brother, Dr. Sacoby Wilson, one of the top scientists in our country, someone who knows public health, environmental justice, and a number of other issues inside and out. Dr. Wilson, how are you?
Doing well, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm blessed and thankful. Dr. Wilson, I know we only have you for a little while because I know how incredibly busy you are. So we want to kind of begin to dive right in, if you don't mind. I have a couple of questions to kind of frame maybe some of the remarks that you're going to share with folks who are watching and participating today. You know, the first one, of course, is your journey, how you got engaged with these issues. The second one that is equally important is, in the work that you do, what are some of the most important issues that we should be working on and the policies that can help to make change happen? And then if we have time, we'll share one other additional question with you. So let me pass the mic to you as we get started here.
Yes, thank you for the invite, and thank you for those questions. My journey, I'm from Mississippi, Vicksburg, Mississippi. So I grew up near the river. I grew up in a community near a major highway, near a sewage treatment plant, near a landfill. My father was a pipe fitter. So my father actually worked at a lot of pollution intensive facilities. So, nuclear power plants, or not environmentally friendly operations, nuclear power plants. The Grand Gulf nuclear power plant was like 20 miles from my house. And also coal-fired power plants, right? And so that kind of got me interested in this field, just where I grew up and what I was exposed to. And also, I had a chance as an undergraduate student at Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University, Alabama A&M, which is a historical Black college. I was a biology ecotoxicology major and with a minor in environmental science. And so got a chance to do research on environmental issues. First study I've ever did was on the use of bacillus licheniformis to degrade contamination in water. It's a bacteria that can break down, contaminants. Then I had a chance to meet you and Dr. Bullard and Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chavis at the ECO conference, right? Well, I always forget what year. Was it 1995? I think it's right.
We're not gonna say what year. We don't want folks to think we're old.
We ain't old. It was in 2005. I'm sorry, but I had a chance to meet Dr. Bullard and Dr. Chavis. So though y'all know Dr. Bullard, as Mustafa just said, is one of those icons in the EJ movement, and also Chavis was really part of the fight, the Warren County fight against the PCB landfill. So when I met them, I was like, oh, I knew I was going to do environmental justice work. And that was like really exciting for me, and it put me on the path to where I am today as environmental scientist does EJ work. Now, getting to your second question about policies and what are important policies, what important issues, I would say if you think about environmental injustice, most EJ issues in the traditional framing. So you have like the differential burden of hazards, locally wanted land uses in communities of color, low wealth communities, places where you have immigrants, rural areas, et cetera, whether it be incinerators, petrochemical operations, right? Landfills, refineries, fracking sites, et cetera. Look at NAACP's report, fumes across the fence line. NAACP's report, cold-blooded. Look at toxic waste and rage, 1987. Toxic waste and rage 2007. Dumping in Dixie. Number of books that Dr. Bullard and others have written. Work by Dr. Marilla Frosch. Work that I've done. Other EJ scholars, Paul Moha, et cetera. Y'all should know these folks. We see that most EJ issues, many of those EJ issues with the differential burden of hazards, are really energy justice issues. So I'm gonna slow down for y'all. Extraction, fracking sites, mining, right? What folks are disproportionately impacted? Transport, pipelines, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, compressor stations, fossil fuels by rail. Who's disproportionately impacted? Refineries, refinement, right? Cancer Alley. Who lives in Cancer Alley? Houston Ship Channel, the largest petrochemical corridor in the country, North America. Who lives in that in those areas? Richmond, California. Latinos, Black folks. Who's living in those areas? Low wealth populations. Highways and byways, combustion. Who lives at the bus depot? Who has the buses going to their neighborhoods? Think about We Act for Environmental Justice, when all the work they at one point in time, Harlem had the highest rate of asthma in the world due to combustion of fossil fuels, due to the combustion of diesel exhaust. Diesel exhaust causes health outcomes. When you burn fossil fuels, it causes pollution being emitted, like particulate matter, leads to asthma attacks, heart disease, stroke, elevation of blood pressure, causes cancer, infant mortality, y'all, birth defects, low birth weight babies, premature mortality, and reduced life expectancy. That's just one pollutant, particulate matter. Think about the complex of living in all these pollutants, right? So energy justice issues, our legacy energy infrastructure, and our energy policies have been a driver of environmental injustice. One of the questioners asked, what about redlining? Look at FHA, HOLC. Oh, these neighborhoods had a lot of folks of color. We're gonna not give them a loan. We're gonna color them red. Oh, these neighborhoods over here, oh, they're white. Oh, they're green. They'll be able to get loans. Because of redlining, what it led to is people not getting access to loans to have a mortgage to own their house. Think about how we build wealth tradition in this country. It's through home ownership, right? But then also what came with that was the loss of municipal services. The loss, as Mustafa already said, the loss of infrastructure. So instead of having just housing, they had unjust housing. Instead of having just food infrastructure, they have unjust food infrastructure, food apartheid. Instead of having just transportation infrastructure, they have unjust transportation infrastructure, right? And so what we're talking about is policies that really, because of the embeddedness of race and racism, right, have led to environmental justice. Mustafa mentioned zoning. Baltimore City was the first city in the country that had racism-based zoning. It was they were trying to pass as a law. Supreme Court threw it out. Julie Z's book, Noxious New York, talks about how New York, why you look at the differential distribution of hazards and Lulus in New York, why it looks that way. Because zoning was weaponized against communities of color, okay? So you gotta think about these policies. And so you look at the Clean Air Act, right? You would say, well, you seen Dr. Wilson, Dr. Mustafa Ali, we worked in the EPA. We know that the air quality has improved over time since the 70s, right? Cuyahoga River was on fire, right? You got all these Love Canal and stuff. Things have improved, but it hasn't improved for folks that look like Mustafa and people who look like me. Folks who are Latino, our API brothers. There's hotspots of pollution, hotspots of environmental inequality where people are being overburdened by hazards and been overexposed to pollution, right? So the Clean Air Act is not protecting the most vulnerable and most susceptible person. Yeah, it may be protecting susceptible people, susceptible folks like children, but it's not protecting the most vulnerable child who may be low income. The Clean Water Act is not doing that. Think about the Safe Drinking Water Act and what happened with Flint. All they had to do was comply with the lead and copper rule, right? That's part of it, right? That's a big part of it. What happened in Flint wouldn't happen in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We got folks across this country, when you think about policy and infrastructure, right, who don't have access to water. We talk globally about wash issues, right? When people don't have access to sanitation, people are defecating outside in a lot of our developing countries, that brothers is defecating outside, right? We got folks in Alabama who are straight piping waste on the ground. One of the world's highest rates of hookworm in the world is in Lowndes County, Alabama. Look at Catherine Flowers, MacArthur Award winner, right? Uniontown, Alabama, when you flush your toilet, usually, hopefully, your waste is going to a sewer treatment plant. Uniontown, Alabama, when they flush their toilet, that waste goes to containment pond. They spray the liquid on the ground. That's policy, y'all. That's the failure of policy in protecting the most vulnerable. The reason why, Mustafa mentioned, the reason why Navajo Nation has been hit so hard by COVID, one of the reasons, because folks don't have potable water. They don't have running. How are you gonna wash your hands, folks, you don't have water? This is the US of A, right? So you got EJ issues that are running rampant. And a lot of this because, and Mustafa talked about it, you got the stolen lands of our indigenous brothers and sisters, the stolen bodies of our African brothers and sisters, the stolen labor of our Chinese brothers and sisters, right? You got racism that's baked into the walls of this country. I have to say racism in America is apple pie. That apple pie ain't tasting too good, right? So what we need to be doing is understand the role of structural racism, institutional racism, and how it's embedded in our housing policy, our healthcare policies, our food policies, right? Our transportation policies, our economic policies. When John Lewis was eulogized, the Reverend talked about plantation capitalism, right? You look at Coach Brian Flores, I'm getting on point here, in the NFL talking about the Rooney Rule. That's plantation capitalism. You got folks who've been used as sacrifice zones in our country for these Lulus, these environmental hazards, because it's called economic development. That's plantation capitalism too. You got the differential burden of COVID on certain groups who have to go out and work, right? They have to go out and go to the restaurant and work, like my niece who had COVID, right? Or nurses who got to go work because people are coming to the hospital who haven't got vaccinated, like my sister who got COVID, right? They both survived, thankfully. You got transportation workers, other workers who have to go out and work because of this. They're part of the have-not, supposedly. And they're forced to be in these environments where they're getting overexposed to SARS-CoV-2. Policy. But also, I'm gonna pass the mic back to Mustafa, is also valuing human rights. Mustafa showed a couple of pictures of people carrying around signs. There's a classic picture that I like to show with Dr. King. This is Black History Month. Last month was the holiday, the King holiday. Dr. King, in my opinion, is the grandfather of the EJ movement. When he was in Memphis on the sanitation worker strike, he was talking about Black men who were being mistreated. There's signs with Black men carrying around signs that say, I am a man, right? So what they were saying is recognize my humanity. Part of environmental justice is we do not recognize humanity in these communities that are being dumped on and been invisibilized. We are not recognizing their humanity when it comes to not having access to food. We're not recognizing their humanity when it comes to not having good air quality. We're not recognizing humanity when they've been over-policed. their humanity when they've been, school to prison pipeline. Their humanity when it comes to folks not having access to certain types of resources. I'll pass the mic back, Mustafa.
No, I appreciate you dropping that knowledge. For everybody who's watching, for everybody who's going to go on this journey with us, we're going to share real talk with you about exactly what's happening in relationship to policy, about exactly what's happening in communities across our country. But we're not going to leave you there. We're also going to talk about the solutions, those community-based solutions that are already in place that in many instances you may not have heard about, and these best practices of how folks are transforming. But that does not take away from the fact that we have to get policy to, as Dr. Wilson just shared, one, be more in touch with its humanity, but also no longer have these disproportionate impacts that are going on. Dr. Wilson, I know we only have you for a short time. I hope maybe you can stay a little longer, but if you can, I totally understand. You raised a couple of things I want to just pull forward, because I know some of the students and others who are watching and participating are probably wondering. You mentioned Lulus. So let's make sure that we share with folks what they are. And then I'd also like for you to share a little bit about your sets of experiences around CAFOs, because I know you've done work both in Maryland and in North Carolina and a number of other areas. And that's an item that we often don't hear enough folks talking about.
Thank you. So LULUs is an acronym for locally wanted land uses. So any kind of pollution intensive land use that can lead to some of these differential impacts we're talking about. So in urban settings, it could be, incinerators. It could be, petrochemical operations, refineries. Remember, the Cancer Alley. You probably learn more about Cancer Alley in part of this discussion. You have pipelines. You have compressor stations, fracking sites, well pads, oil and gas wells. Think about all the oil and gas wells in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. You also have other types of operations where, again, the factories that emit, so they may have a permit from the EPA. It could be a Clean Air Act permit as a major source to release into the, certain types of pollutants into the air. And so any type of operation that's really emitting pollution, it could be more of a stationary source, or it could be like that's a term I'm probably gonna misdefine it, but the area source as well. So more general kind of source. So think about highways and byways in many cases that going through Black and brown communities, AA communities, right? Where there's a lot of combustion byproducts. Folks don't want those highways and byways, basically destroying their neighborhoods. And that's again a remnant of as we talked before, redlining, right? And so that you have that. Now, CAFOs, that acronym is concentrated animal feeding operations. What you have is a large concentration of animals grown in a small confined space. I did my dissertation on industrial hog farms in North Carolina. These hog farms are primarily located in the eastern, what we call the eastern hydrophysiologic plain. So basically, eastern North Carolina has a lot of water. And so a lot of rivers and streams. Just want to use a big word real quick for y'all. I'm an academic in East North Carolina. But those operations are located primarily in communities that are Black and brown and low wealth. The two largest producers of hogs in the country are in North Carolina, Duplin County and Sampson County. An adult hog, a pig, creates 4+ times the amount of waste an adult human does. But their waste does not go to a treatment plant. That waste is piped into what they call a lagoon. It's basically an open hole in the ground. So in the houses that hold the animals, you can have off-gassing of particulate matter, volatile compounds. You got animal fur, skin cells, all that kind of stuff, bioaerosols. Then you have volatilization of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide off the lagoons. You can also have leaching of the nutrients, the nitrogenous compounds into groundwater, right? And then they take the liquid effluent off the top of the lagoon and they spray that on the field. So that material can blow into people's homes, into their gardens. And so work has been done by Dr. Chris Haney, who's a professor at Hopkins, who's shown that they've been able to track the DNA that's found in the feces of hog waste in homes by doing what we call microbiome studies, okay? So the DNA of the hog should not be in my house. The DNA of the hog should not be on my, in my kid's bedroom, on my kitchen floor, right? And so when you expose these pollutants, it can cause, ammonia hydrosulfide, burning eyes, nose, and throat. It can lead to asthma. Of course, there's also runoff that can impact. Most of these folks in eastern North Carolina are on well water. So you get nitrates, microbes like E. coli, cryptosporidium, not cryptosporidium, that's a different, not maybe, but Campylobacter, I meant to say, not cryptosporidium, E. coli, Campylobacter, Salmonella, you can have those and also in the water as well. So, and then in up here in Maryland, Delaware, I've been doing more work on the issue of chicken farms. So any of you who've gone to, vacation in Delaware or vacation, in Maryland in the Eastern Shore, you may have driven by some of the chicken farms, and they have similar impacts. But instead of the waste being stored in a lagoon, hog waste is wet, chicken waste is dry, so it's piled up high, 8-9 feet tall piles of chicken crap. That's the best word I can use. It's another word I want to use, and they can become windblown, and people can breathe in the windblown waste, particles, and it also get in people's homes and have deleterious health effects. So I'll stop there.
All right. Well, Dr. Wilson, I want to honor your team's request to not keep you too long, but we do have one of the other luminaries who dropped a question in the chat. That would be Dr. Adrienne Hollis. And she said, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between historic racism and COVID-19?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So you think about, historic racism or those racist policies. As I was saying before, these policies kind of get embedded in our housing policies, racism embedded in our housing policies. So think about a number of low wealth populations who maybe live in rental housing, multi-family units where you have a greater exposure, number of people in a smaller space. You have poor HVAC systems, so you have the air exchange. So you think about SARS-CoV-2, think about through the hygiene hypothesis, you need to be able to have some air exchange to remove the air that may have, because SARS-CoV-2 can be airborne. If you don't have good air exchange, that increases your exposure. If you're in poor housing conditions, that can increase your exposure. And you have a lot of people living in multifamily units, right? That means you have a chance of more frequent, air exchange and potentially exposure there. And also you get back, think about historic policies, racism when it comes to water policy, right? You have a lot of folks who don't have access to potable water. That's the EJ issue. So from our brothers and sisters who are agricultural workers, our folks in the Deep South they're post-slavery Black neighborhoods that don't have sewer and water infrastructure, their own well water, our folks that live in the colonias along the border of Texas, and our brothers and sisters live on reservations. That's because of, again, that's racism that's baked into our policies. And so if you don't have access to running water, again, in all those contexts, how are you gonna be able to wash your hands, right? So think about basic sanitation and basic hygiene. And then again, I think because of some of our, historic racism and related policies, a lot of populations have been made invisible, right? And COVID-19 has made them visible. And so I think that's like we said, well, while certain populations have been hit so hard by COVID, because of the lack of access to healthcare, right? Or even you think about Tuskegee and people's uncertainty around vaccines and testing, right? And our inability for certain communities like the Black community to say, well, this is beneficial to you, but in the past, because of medical racism and medical apartheid, that's led some folks to not really trust the medical system. And so that's part of the reason why you may have some people not getting tested. But it also is a healthcare access issue. So when people you remember there's some stories of the Black nurse who was actually in the hospital and said, y'all are not giving me good care. And she had COVID. Remember, she died. I forget her name, but she died. You've seen other examples of people trying to get testing in New York and other parts of the country, but because of their skin color, they were turned away, right? So there's multiple reasons why you see higher rates of morbidity and mortality from COVID-19, but a lot is due to how we treat people or mistreat them because of their skin color, and also the access to infrastructure they had because of historic policies that reduced or it really negatively impacted the ability to have access to clean water or the ability to have access to healthcare. And even real quickly, pass the mic back, even food access, y'all. If you're not healthy from eating nutritious foods, that has an impact. Your diet has an impact on your ability to fight against disease, right? Think about food apartheid. Why there's so many, as Mustafa mentioned before, so many communities of color who don't have access to good food infrastructure. Instead of having a grocery store or supermarkets, they have a lot of fast food restaurants, or they live in what we call a food desert, a food swamp, right? But food desert, food swamps are symptoms of a larger problem. We have a broken food system, and the term that reflects that broken food system is food apartheid.
Mm-hmm. And then we'll just real quickly also to build upon what you shared, when we know that over 500,000 people every night go to bed housing insecure, some folks would say homeless, we also understand the challenges that exist for them and being able to protect themselves from COVID-19. And we'll talk a little bit about this here in a bit, their exposures to environmental toxins as well, which also plays a role in their ability to fight off diseases and a number of other things.
Yeah, I know I got to go, Mustafa, but just on that point, for those of you who want to look, we actually had an environmental justice and homelessness session at our last EJ symposium, UMD EJ symposium. You can go to ceejh.center and look for the 2021 symposium. But your point is really important because there's a lot of policies out there where we treat homeless people like they're a virus. And so we try to push them out to certain parts of cities where there's no infrastructure, or we push them out to certain parts of cities that are already dealing with contamination issues. So they're already a very vulnerable population. When we put them in an environmental context that makes them more vulnerable, so as Mustafa just said, increases their risk of exposure to chemical stressors. They may be living in an area there's a lot of traffic, or in the area that the building has lead paint, or the building has biological stressors like mold, mildew, or pests or rats, or more exposure to biological stresses, as Mustafa just said, like SARS-CoV-2. So that's important. So we have to change our policies and how we are responding to the folks who are housing insecure. Go ahead, Mustafa.
Well, Dr. Wilson, again, I know you're short on time, so if you need to roll, I completely understand. But I want to make sure that folks who are watching have the opportunity, because you and I have these conversations about technology and the role that it plays. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to just kind of talk a little bit about some of the stuff you're doing around GIS screening and some other things. And then before you leave, if you could just make sure that you share the information of where folks can follow you to get even deeper into some of these conversations.
Okay, yes, thank you for that, Mustafa. So I think, technology can be part of the problem, right? I was talking to someone recently about the word industry. The word industry, when you say it, has a bad connotation. It's like, but it doesn't have to be bad, right? Technology, it could be used for bad or good. So what I'm trying to do with my work is use technology more for tech engagement, tech assessment, and tech solutions, right? So part of what we're doing on the tech assessment side, we do a lot of work using sensors to monitor air quality. So we're building hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks in the Mid-Atlantic to really get at this issue of pollution, particularly traffic-related air pollution that goes through certain, again, people's communities. We got some money from the Bezos Earth Fund to expand some network. I know some irony there, but I'll keep it moving. And so, because we just did a panel 2 weeks ago with Consumer Reports about Amazon warehouses and differential impact of Amazon warehouses on communities of color. So y'all can look at that video. It should be online. Go to Consumer Reports to see more about that. So we have that work, but we also are developing apps. We got this app called My Block Counts that allows folks to get environmental quality information at the block level, and we want to be able to map that and then use that as decision support tools to inform decision making at the local level, right? And we also do a lot of work on developing environmental justice screening tools. So we have a tool called Maryland EJ Screen. I'm also helping out with other screening tools around the country. And so you can go to siege.center to find out more about the symposium, about the work that we're doing. We just got some money also from Meta. I know Meta's not doing well today, but really engaging them to help us build out our summer scholars program, to build up my administrative core, and also again to be able to access some of the technology to better help communities that have EJ issues. And you can also follow me on Twitter. I think my Twitter handle is Dr. EJ.
Yes, it is Dr. EJ. Everyone, please follow Dr. EJ, Dr. Sacoby Wilson. What I love about Sacoby is that he's not just one of those folks who are sitting around thinking about things in a theoretical construct, but he's actually working with communities on the ground to make change happen. And that's what it's all about, is being able to actually help folks to be able to transform the situations that they're in. Dr. Wilson, any closing words before you go?
Well, I wish I had more time. Another thing for y'all to check in. We've done too. I'm a co-founder of this new coalition, the Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition. Actually, the longer name is the Mid-Atlantic Economic Environmental Justice Coalition, but I like to call it MAGIC. Check out MAGIC too. So MAGIC it covers DC, Delaware, Virginia, and Maryland. And so for the students you want to get engaged with MAGIC, you can email me as well. And then also, we have a student organization at UMD called 17 for Peace and Justice. So what's that 17 should be familiar to y'all, EJ, it's based off of the 17 principles of environmental justice. The idea is we want to have student chapters across the country, every university in the country, have a chapter of 17 for Peace and Justice. So if you're interested in starting a chapter at your university, again, email me. You can my emails in the chat. So thank you, Mustafa, for the time, and I gotta roll out, y'all.
All right, well, we appreciate you. I know a lot of folks are clapping and some folks are jumping up and down and others are thinking in a very deep fashion about some of the things you shared. Dr. Wilson, thank you so much. We'll talk soon.
Yes, sir. Yep, y'all take care.
All right. So Dr. Wilson just shared with us, some of the realities when we're dealing with policy. So I want you all to remember that when we're talking about environmental justice, we are talking about housing justice, food justice, transportation justice. We are talking about also the disparities that have taken place in the medical field, and also on the public health side of the equation. We're talking about economic justice. And we are also talking about civil justice or voting justice as well. And we will unpack that as we move forward through our next 5 sets of seminars that will be a part of this series. But I want to real quickly go back to the slides that we were looking at to tie them into some of the things that Dr. Wilson just shared with us. And as that's coming forward, I just want to also remind folks, I hope you have had a chance, as Dr. Wilson talked about, to look at the 17 principles of environmental justice. Those are foundational elements that frontline leaders came together in 1991 to create, and are really some great guideposts for the sets of work in relationship to policy and other areas that have to happen if we're ever going to be able to create healthy and sustainable communities and make sure that all voices are a part of the process. So let's start to move forward. I'm going to move quickly through this because we're going to talk about many of these items in the other sets of seminars, but I wanted to just plant a seed with you. So next slide. If we're going to continue our conversation around environmental justice, we have to understand that there have been these challenges that have happened in the past, but also through diligent work by people being very committed that we're able to change those dynamics. We know that for a long time, women were stripped of many of their rights, their right to vote, their right to own land, and other dynamics that made them vulnerable to a number of dynamics that have gone on inside of our country. And we want to just bring that forward because it will be a part of future conversations. Next slide. We also want to bring forward, and Dr. Wilson talked about the I Am a Man campaign that was a part of the civil rights movement. And in 1968, when Dr. King was unfortunately assassinated in Memphis, he was a part of those sanitation workers who were asking for justice. They were asking for justice in relationship to the things they were being exposed to, but they were also asking for justice and making sure that they were paid a fair wage. And the civil rights movement is so critical to environmental justice because many of the early leaders in the environmental justice movement came out of the civil rights movement. They came out of the Chicano movement. They came out of the AIM movement and a number of other movements, which were the training grounds for them to be able to take up the mantle and begin to work and push for real change in relationship to addressing environmental injustice. Next slide. And another key sort of moment in time is also the early environmental movement. By no means perfect, but it began to put a spotlight. And you heard Dr. Wilson also talk about the Cuyahoga River, it catching on fire. That's hard for some of us to conceptualize who are not old enough to have seen that. But there were rivers across our country that literally were filled, not just debris and not just cars, but also all kinds of toxic materials. And some of those were flammable. And of course, many of those were carcinogenic. And there were a number of different dynamics that were playing out that brought this late 60s, early 70s, a set of action, which out of that came many of our landmark pieces of legislation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and a number of others, and NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, in the late 60s, that you will hear a lot of conversations about here over the coming sets of weeks from the White House and from a number of others. Next slide. Now, if we're going to have a real authentic conversation about environmental justice moving forward, let me first call out that it is a matriarchal movement. You will see some men, of course, but it has really been the sisters who have been able to hold it down. And you're seeing some of those images that are there. On my right-hand side, on the top left-hand of that block, is Hazel Johnson. Hazel Johnson is known as the mother of the environmental justice movement. I hope that you will Google her and learn a little bit about her. Now, she was before the internet, so there's not going to be a huge amount of information, but she was transformational in helping to make change happen. And you see a number of the other amazing women who to this day are holding it down and who are actually helping to make transformation happen. Next slide. And these are a few of the others who I also just wanted to highlight for you. One of the questions earlier came from Dr. Adrienne Hollis, who's actually on the screen here. And you will see sisters from across the planet who are playing an amazing role in making sure that their voices and their stories and their power are all coming together to be able to make change happen. Next slide. This is a photo for me that really speaks a lot because it really highlights some of the actions that we've done in this country that have placed children, especially children of color, in very dangerous situations. And it makes me always reminded of the fact that these toxic chemicals, these hazardous chemicals, no one should ever have to deal with them. No one should ever be in close proximity. But yet that is the dynamic that we have created in our country. But let me just also preface that by saying that there are ways for us to actually make real change happen. Sometimes we get so stuck on thinking that change can happen that we don't think creatively about how we can make that become a reality. This is little Miss Flint. She's a little bit bigger than that now. And she always reminds me every time we talk that Flint lives matter. And those lives, we all know, were impacted. Dr. Wilson touched a little bit on the dynamics there in Flint. There are over 3,000 locations across our country that have higher levels of lead in their water than Flint did. And folks in Flint are still struggling to be able to have a drink of clean, fresh water. Now, the media may tell you something different, but if you have conversations with folks who are there, they're still struggling. Next slide. Now, why are we having this conversation? Is this just something that has happened in the past, or are there still dynamics that are playing out every day in people's lives? Now, this slide tells you that we've got over 200,000 people who are dying prematurely from air pollution annually in our country. The United States of America, depending on how you want to define it, is known as one of the greatest countries of all time, but yet we have more people who are dying from air pollution than are dying from gun violence. And that's a very, very serious issue. We have more people dying from air pollution than are dying from car crashes. And we all know somebody who's lost their life in that situation. We have more people dying from air pollution than are dying from overdoses of drugs. I want you to let that sit with you for a second. If we have more people who are dying from air pollution than from car crashes, from drugs, overdoses of drugs, and also from gun violence, why isn't it that we don't hear about this every day? Why is it that we are not moving forward to completely eliminate that situation as rapidly as possible? And we also know that that air pollution that is killing Black and brown people and lower wealth people disproportionately is also, and y'all hold on to this, that same air pollution that is playing a significant role in the warming up of our oceans and the warming up of our planet and driving many of the climate crises that we see each and every day, whether we turn on our television or for some folks, when you step out on your back porches. So we've got to get serious about the air pollution that we literally have a pandemic situation that is dealing with. Next slide. Now, we have 24 million folks in our country who currently are suffering from asthma and 7 million children. And we know that disproportionately it is African-American and Latinx children who are the ones who are going to the emergency rooms and the ones who are losing their lives. And we also know that asthma and liver and kidney diseases, a number of other breathing problems and cancers, and these cancer clusters in some instances are tied to that air pollution that I just talked about. And we also know that it makes you more vulnerable and susceptible to COVID-19. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. Next slide. We also got to be very focused on our infrastructure throughout our country and where we are in relationship to air pollution, because as the slide shares with you, premature death, asthma attacks, heart attacks, strokes, cardiovascular related impacts, lung cancers, low birth weight babies, infant mortality, which lots of times people don't know is linked to air pollution. We also have a number of other diseases that are connected to the stuff that we end up breathing. Next slide. So now it's time to just go a little bit deeper. Whether we're talking about the 48217, which is in Detroit, one of the places that I grew up in two places in Appalachia, and I lived in Detroit for a little while. The 48217 is one of the most polluted zip codes across our country. When kids look out the window there, instead of seeing trees and green space like so many others have been able to do, they see facilities, they see plants, they see, unfortunately, and are exposed to pollution. Next slide. Dr. Wilson, who's done work in Baltimore, along with a number of other just amazing leaders. I just wanted to call out that you don't have to go very far. Here in Washington, DC, there are all kinds of impacts that are happening in relationship to air pollution, especially with our highway systems that are going on. And then just right up the Beltway, there in Baltimore, in Curtis Bay, there are amazing students have been pushing back against sort of the cumulative impacts and the toxic loading that's been happening in their communities. And we just wanted to raise them up, and we will talk more about that as we move throughout the series. Next slide. Now, sometimes folks think, well, you know, this is only a problem in the urban core, but our national parks are also being significantly impacted from air pollution. And of course, the climate crisis is also having some impacts that are happening in our national parks. Most folks would never, ever think that 96% of our national parks are dealing with significant air quality impacts. I want you all to think about it. I'm a person who grew up in the outdoors, has spent a lot of time there. And lots of times, you know, we go to parks, national parks, state parks, because we want to get away. We want to move away from all the noise, sometimes away from the pollution. And now we're finding that there are significant impacts that are happening, even in those spaces and places that we often use to recharge and to reconnect. And that's just one additional reason that we have to be laser focused on addressing these issues. Next slide. I want to call out this, and I want you to really look at this particular picture. This is the Manchester community in Houston, Texas, a hardworking Latinx community. And this is Cesar Chavez High School. Now you can't see the full picture there, but the track is there. You see the team that's practicing. You see other folks who are out there exercising. And just in the background, you see the flaring that's happening. Now, when you go to the Manchester community and you roll down the windows of your car, you feel like you're breathing in gasoline fumes. And people are dealing with that situation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. And it's amazing also that we expect students to be able to learn in these types of situations. And this is not the only example like this across the country, but I really want you to hold on to this imagery as we take this journey together and figuring out ways for us to make sure that these types of situations are left and that we're able to move forward in the 21st century with a different set of results and a different paradigm that we're operating from. Next slide. This is another sort of breakdown of some of the things that are happening there in the Manchester community and some of the exposures from the things that you saw coming out of those stacks. I'll also share with you, and I want you all to, if you, in the sound of my voice, I want you to just reach out your arm, whether it's your left arm or your right arm, as far as you can reach it. And now that you're doing that, I want you to also be aware of the fact that folks who live in the Manchester community, sometimes some of the folks can actually stand in their backyards or their front yards and literally touch the fencing, and in some instances, the piping in these facilities. That goes back to that earlier conversation around zoning. And how could we ever allow for these types of situations to go on, to have people so closely located to these types of exposures? And again, the breakdown of vinyl chloride and mercury and arsenic and hydrogen cyanide and benzene and leads and a number of other chemicals that are cancer-causing chemicals. Next slide. This is a diesel death zone in California. In these areas, not only do you have a huge amount of refineries, you also have significant amounts of pollution that is also coming from transportation related situations and sets of exposures. And they just have amazing rates of cancer that are happening in this community. And you can see why. You know, if you're outside and you're playing in green spaces on fields, you're running, you're taking in even more of that toxic pollution. Or if your house is actually located so close to these types of things, once again, you're getting those exposures. You heard Dr. Wilson talk about Cancer Alley, which is in Louisiana, runs from Baton Rouge down to New Orleans. And for as far as the eye can see, all you will see are petrochemical facilities and other facilities that are just spewing out huge amounts of pollution. And I just want to remind you of this fact also there. Those communities actually were founded by freed enslaved people, and these facilities then moved and surrounded them because of a number of different dynamics around policy and other things that allowed these situations to take place. And we will unpack that as we move forward. Next slide. This is just reinforcing the fact that when we talked about vehicle accidents and gun violence and the connection to air pollution, some of the things folks don't also know is now that there are studies that are also linking air pollution to both Alzheimer's and other cognitive related conditions. So once again, we have to get very serious, very fast to make sure that we are addressing the needs of communities who are dealing with these exposures. Next slide. So let's just go with the foundational element that clean air has to be a human right. You can't live without air for very long, and you can't live the fullness of your lifetime if you are continually breathing in dirty air. Next slide. Clean water also has to be a human right. We have 60 million people in our country who are dealing with unsafe drinking water over the last decade, even with many of the laws that we have in place. So we have to be laser focused on making sure that environmental justice is fully integrated into our statutes, into our sets of actions. Next slide. Now, what's transporting some of our fossil fuels, of course, is pipelines. And you all have heard many of the pipeline fights that have been going on. We have 2.4 million miles of fossil fuel pipeline. Most folks don't realize that and make the assumption, well, we probably just need to build more. That 2.4 million miles is enough to take you to the moon and back, and on your way again to the moon. That's how much fossil fuel pipeline we have in the United States of America, not across the planet, but in our country. And it's time for us to begin to cut our addiction to fossil fuels. And it is also time for us to begin a just transition away from these types of fossil fuel related economies and moving toward a cleaner economy. Next slide. Now this are a set of slides that I'm going to go through real quickly of some of the pipelines that are out there and some of the fights that are still going on. You've got the Line 5 pipeline that's there in Michigan, and many folks for a considerable amount of time have been fighting to begin to shut that down. And you'll see the pictures of the pipeline running through the water. Let me be very clear with folks, and we can move forward with the facts on this, that pipelines leach, pipelines break, and that there are impacts both to the land and the water when that happens. And that's some of the reasons that people are moving so diligently to begin to shut down these pipelines, especially in many of our most pristine places and spaces that provide our drinking water and a number of other things. Next slide. Now, I'm one who believes let's also integrate the arts. I integrate the arts into everything I do because I think it helps us to build bridges. It also helps to connect with different sets of groups who might not necessarily just be attracted to the policy conversation or the scientific conversation or the legal conversation. So I'm always thankful to those artists that I've worked with and others who I don't know, but that I respect, who are stepping up and also getting engaged. Each and every one of us has power. We just have to kind of figure out how we best want to utilize it. Many of them utilize their platforms to help bring attention to issues. Next slide. The Bayou Bridge pipeline is another set of struggles and fights that are going on by many of our brothers and sisters in the southern part of our country to actually say, we don't need this. There's no value added by bringing it here, and that we want you to join us in helping to protect our lives. Next slide. Next slide. Flint water crisis, incredibly important, and it's also a flashpoint. You will find as we go through these conversations, there are these different flashpoints that really begin to not just pull at people's heartstrings, but make people start to ask the hard questions of how could this possibly happen in our country? And what is it that we need to do differently to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Next slide. That's Little Miss Flint again. And then you may know the brother there on the right-hand side, that's Jaden Smith. Jaden's actually created a company around getting water to communities who need it the most. So we really want to call out Jaden and thank him for all the work that he continues to do. He didn't just show up in one moment. He's continued in that. Benton Harbor, Michigan is one of those other communities I mentioned earlier. Benton Harbor actually has higher levels of lead in its water than Flint does. And again, there are numerous other examples across our country. Next slide. I wanted to call out another area that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to, and I also want to link it. Most folks don't know that plastics actually come from petrol products. So when you see those pipelines, when you see those refineries, they are all playing a role in plastics. And we know that there's just this huge amount of plastics, whether in our rivers and our streams, in our lakes and our ponds, and in our oceans, of course. And many of you have seen some of these plastic patches that just go for as far as the eye can see in our oceans. As I've traveled around the country, I'm amazed that when I go to beaches that don't have a regular cleaning, the amount of plastics. And I also remind folks that even though we have recycling programs in many locations across our country, a lot of the plastics still make it back into landfills. And those landfills, when the plastics are not recycled, end up once again in Black and brown communities, because that's where, once again, our policies and our zoning has allowed to be placed. So when you see plastic, we have to think about it in a number of different dynamics. Luckily, folks are starting to no longer just have single-use plastics, and people are beginning to move forward and utilizing the existing plastics in a number of different ways. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about fashion and some other things. Next slide. Once again, water is a human right. I will continue to say that. You can't live, once again, very long without water, but it needs to be clean water. And it's utilized, water is utilized in so many different ways. And we're going to talk about many of those different dynamics as we move forward. Next slide. This is Miss Monica Lewis-Patrick. She'll be joining us at a future seminar. She's out of Michigan and has been working diligently in addressing many of the water quality issues that are happening there in Detroit. And it's the work that she and we, the people of Detroit, do is so transformational, because not only are they trying to make sure that folks have access to clean water, but that it is also affordable. There are a number of different dynamics that are going on in relationship to water that we often don't think about. The shutoffs that have happened, and they began to get in some of the national news when folks were putting together the stimulus bills and the moratoriums that ended up having some folks losing their children, their credit being impacted, and a number of other dynamics that were going on with the water shutoffs. And we're going to go deep into that subject in one of our future seminars. But I want to plant the seed with you, and I want to make sure that if you get an opportunity that you are Googling Ms. Monica Patrick Lewis. Some of the work that she's doing also is also helping people to understand that, that there's this exponential set of costs that are being associated with people's water bills and the dynamics that play out from that. And again, we'll go deeper. Next slide. Water is life. Our Indigenous brothers and sisters continue to remind us of this. It is a part of their cultural understanding and practices, but it has to also be a part of everyone across our planet, understanding that, it is critical for our own survival, and we should be protecting it as such. Next slide. Now, I'd like to call out folks who's getting it done. And there are so many amazing organizations, but I just wanted to call out the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, better known as WAWA, because of the citizen science that the students are doing there. These are young people, some of them younger than the folks who are watching today, who have actually committed there in Atlanta to being a part of the solution and doing all kinds of amazing things to make sure that the folks in their community and in surrounding communities have cleaner water and that everyone can access those streams and small rivers that are a part of that tributary. Next slide. Everybody has picked up and utilized a plastic bottle. I wanted to call out the fact again, when we're talking about plastics, that over 35 billion plastic bottles are thrown away every year. And we have to make the change. We began that slow, important set of actions around plastic bags and some other actions in that space. And there are opportunities. And some of the folks who will come forward will talk to you about some of the economic opportunities and business opportunities that folks are utilizing to address the plastic pollution that many are facing across our planet. Next slide. This is a statistic that came out a little while ago that was talking about that there'll be more plastic in our oceans than fish by 2050. 2050 is one of those numbers that you will continue to see, whether we're talking about impacts that are happening to the ocean, sets of actions that need to happen in relationship to lowering the overall carbon and methane that are in our atmosphere, and some of the really dire sets of actions that will happen from the climate crisis if we don't meet some of these goals that run up to 2050. Next slide. These are just some more amazing students who are doing what they can to make transformation happen. Next slide. Algae blooms are another sort of issue that's going on, not only up in the Great Lakes area, but also in a number of rivers and other tributaries across our country. Some of it is because of runoff that's happening from farms and other agricultural practices. Also the increases in temperature, and many of our water bodies are also playing a role. And there are a few other elements that we will illuminate as we move forward. Next slide. We have to be focused on clean water for all. And unfortunately, that has not been the paradigm that we have fully embraced. We have to make sure that everyone in our country and across the planet has access to clean, safe, and affordable water. Next slide. Now, in relationship, before we leave our conversation around water, I just wanted to also call out the fact that, and you heard Dr. Wilson touch on this, that there's serious issues that are going on in relationship to fracking. And I know it is a part currently of our energy infrastructure that we have in our country, but there are some serious, significant impacts that are happening. I've been in the fracking fields. I've been in people's homes and some of these areas where, you know, folks literally can take a lighter and light it next to the water that's coming out of their taps, and it catches on fire. Now, the folks will go through all of these different reasons for that type of dynamic, but where I come from, that can't be normal. And the other part of that is many of the fluids and things and solvents that are used, you see in that gentleman's hand the water situation that his family is dealing with. So perception is reality in many instances. Next slide. This is just reinforcing the fact around the fracking, you know, 72 trillion gallons of water that is currently dealing with these multiple sets of chemicals that are a part of that process. Next slide. Fracking is happening, you know, in all kinds of locations, whether we're talking about Michigan or Pennsylvania or a number of other areas. Next slide. These are just calling out, you know, where some of the wells currently are across our country. You will be able to see the state based upon where you come from. Now, all of these things are leading to the climate crisis. So let me make sure that we're very clear, and we'll be closing out here shortly, is that we can't win on the climate crisis if we don't win on environmental injustice. If you look at where many of the fossil fuel facilities are located, they're located in communities of color, in lower wealth communities, and sometimes on indigenous lands. If we look at the way that our transportation systems have been created and where we put our highways and our roads, there is a strong correlation also. We know that transportation is one of the major drivers for the climate crisis. We also know that when we look at where deforestation is happening, where trees are being cut down, jungles, rainforests, it has been Black and brown and indigenous people who have been the ones who have been guarding those for millennia. And because of the sets of actions that have been going on, it all is contributing to the climate crisis. And of course, the other dynamic of one of the major drivers is around agriculture and animal husbandry are some of the other parts to that equation. And then we see these dynamics that are going on. We see the hurricanes that continue to cost us just huge amounts of money. Most folks don't realize the billions upon billions upon billions of dollars that each one of these storms and fires and floods and heat events and a few other dynamics are actually costing us. So it would just make sense for us to make the investments now instead of waiting until things continue to escalate to a point where we can no longer financially be able to do what's necessary to make change happen. Next slide. This is some of the results of the climate crisis. And we often forget about the Virgin Islands, and there are a number of other places that we often forget when these climate crises hit. But definitely after the crisis is initially over, we often forget about the communities who are left behind, who are continuing to struggle, and the policies that may or may not be helpful in helping them to be able to reclaim and to transition. Next slide. I guess I gotta quickly give a shout out to my sister, the Queen Bee, Beyonce, for everything that she has done and continues to do. When the hurricanes rushed through Houston, she was one of the folks, and there were others who stood up and contributed both their time and their wealth to be able to help folks to get back up on their feet. There are a number of artists and entertainers who continue to be in this space, but we need more. Just like we need each and every one of us to also be a part of that stepping up. Next slide. Hurricane Maria. I have family from Puerto Rico, and the devastation that happened in Puerto Rico. Next slide, and you'll see some of this. It's just, to this day, folks are still recovering. And yes, we had over 3,000 people who lost their lives. At one time, we had leadership that tried to say just a handful of people unfortunately passed away. And then, of course, all of the devastation that happened to the infrastructure, which is so critical for people being able to move forward, and a number of policy sets of actions that traditionally have been in place that made it difficult for folks on the island to be able to get the things that they needed, is another dynamic that we have to continue to work on, because we know these types of climate impacts, these climate emergencies, are going to unfortunately continue. We've got to make sure that that safety net, that social safety net, is in place in all forms and fashions. Next slide. Just a quick shout out both to Fat Joe and Daddy Yankee, who also showed up. Of course, they have roots in Puerto Rico, and also played a role in helping to get resources to brothers and sisters on the island. Next slide. And of course, it's not just in the islands. You know, we have immense flooding that's happening all across our country. Ellicott City, which is just up the street in Maryland, you know, had historical flooding twice over the last few years there, in Dearborn and in Houston, in the 5th Ward in New Orleans. I mean, I can just keep going on and on and on with different communities that have been impacted. What I meant to say was the 5th Ward in Houston, and also in New Orleans. Next slide. Another example of the sets of things that are going on. And when we have the flooding that's happening, and we have these storms that are happening, we have to remember that there are disproportionate impacts, that communities of color are the ones that are getting hit first and worst. And again, it goes back to our earlier conversation around policies and where we push people and where people are only allowed to live. And in many instances, it was in floodplains. It was in these other low-lying areas that now, as the sea levels continue to rise, and as we have more moisture in the atmosphere that is causing these longer and more intense downpours, we see these types of situations that are happening. And we know, because we have the data to show it, that even after these situations are over, many of these communities have a very difficult time in ever being able to make it back home, reclaiming their homes and being made whole. Next slide. And I wanted to call this out real quickly too. We're almost done. The farm workers who are out there, you know, and we saw in a number of the wildfires that were going on, that workers were continually in the fields. They were breathing in the pollution that comes from wildfires. And they were also being placed in very dangerous conditions. Now, for farm workers, there are a number of different situations that are going on, lack of access to water in some instances, exposures to pesticides, and of course, these climate crises, these wildfires that you have brothers and sisters also having to deal with. And once again, we have to be thinking critically, not only about mitigating the impacts that are happening from the climate crisis, but actually embracing our humanity in these types of situations and making sure that brothers and sisters are fully protected. Next slide. This is some information I wanted to share with everyone. $150 billion just last year in our country in relationship to climate disasters. This information actually comes from NOAA, and they break down, if you go to their website, they break down each and every one of these instances. And then we begin to see, in totality, the cumulative impacts, these stressors that are happening inside of our country. And I just want to real quickly, as we move to the next slide, remind folks that whether it is the climate disasters or folks who are constantly being impacted from toxic pollution, that there is a mental health impact that is also linked to those ongoing sets of stressors. And we often don't talk about that and begin to bring into the conversation the tools and resources that folks will need in this moment and in future sets of opportunities to help people to deal with the mental health, the physical health, and then also I like to have a conversation also about the spiritual health, because I believe in the mind, body, and spirit. Next slide. There are ways for us to address many of these issues that are going on. Policy will play a role in the new clean economy. You've seen the sets of conversations and discussions and disagreements that have happened around moving forward on a clean economy, the Build Back Better Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and there will be others that will have to be a part of our set of tools to be able to address the climate crisis, to address the injustices that are happening in our most vulnerable communities, and to make sure that there is truly a just transition where no one gets left behind. And wind, solar, thermal, tidal, new sets of technologies will be a part of that, along with a suite of other sets of financial and economic opportunities. And we are going to have some amazing folks. We're not just talking the talk, but actually walking the walk, who will come and share with us. Next slide. That these are some of the, if you've never seen the wind turbines that are developed, I just want to throw this one in there because when I go home to visit my mom, I drive through Western Maryland. And right before I drop down into West Virginia, if you look back on the mountaintops, you will see these huge wind turbines. And then when you go into West Virginia, you no longer see that. And I always pose the question about what is it about folks on that Western Maryland side of that mountain that have been able to embrace a future set of economic opportunities? And what have been the impediments to folks on those same mountains that just happen to be on the West Virginia side of the border that is stopping that from happening? And that's when we get into a deeper set of conversations around policy and politics and how it can have economic impacts in your life. Next slide. Now, I just want to share with you all, we're going to go through these slides really quickly. You know, folks will often say, well, Mustafa, can you show me how change is happening? And it is happening in different places across our country, and we need to exponentially grow it out. But the Regenesis Project, I would ask each and every one of you as a takeaway, to actually take a peek at this particular project. We're actually going to have Harold Mitchell, who's going to come and join us, along with a number of other leaders who have been very focused on, helping to create these transformational sets of opportunities in communities. But real quickly, I just wanted to touch on it. They took a $20,000 environmental justice small grant, something the previous administration wanted to eliminate. And they were able to leverage it into over $300 million in changes in that community. They had many of the dynamics that we see in communities, whether in Appalachia or the Rust Belt or the Gulf Coast or in the breadbasket or on our coast or in Alaska or Puerto Rico, very similar sets of dynamics that are happening in relationship to lack of access to healthcare, impacts happening from brownfields and Superfund sites, the need for job creation, the need for new housing. And they were able, and you can go to the next slide, they were able to actually make sure that community voices were a part of the visioning, making sure that community voices were a part of the design, making sure that they were able to have authentic collaborative partnerships of bringing over 144 partners together. And this is just some quick examples. I don't want to take away from what Representative Harold Mitchell is going to share with you all, but they got 500 new green homes there. And you might be asking yourself, well, those are nice and pretty homes, but you know, why is that important? Well, it's important because one of the ways that we build wealth in this country is through housing. And also that people were paying $300 to $400 a month before for their electricity costs. And now with these new green homes that have been put in place, it's now down to $65 a month and will be eventually zeroed out. And I'll talk about that in one moment. Next slide. That's former EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy. The gentleman there is Harold Mitchell. And the other lady who's there is the former EPA Region 4 Administrator, Heather McToney. And next slide, and this will all make sense. That's a healthcare center that they put in place. So they also were able to get these healthcare centers in place because folks had to travel great distances to be able to get there, especially seniors. They got community centers in place where seniors and young people get a chance to come together, which is important for an intergenerational connections and sets of actions. Next slide. And here's the other part. Those brownfields and Superfund sites that Harold Mitchell will talk to you about, they've all been cleaned up now thanks to the hard work that he did. And they're putting a 35-acre solar farm in, which will zero out people's electricity costs. So people went from paying $300 to $400 a month for their electricity costs in the old shotgun housing. They now have new green homes, and they will literally be paying $0 for their electricity costs. So now they're building wealth through their housing stock, and they are also building wealth by eliminating that electricity cost. And for many communities of color, their utilities sometimes can be a third of their overall set of income that they have. Next slide. The other part, because I'm always focused on the future, is that we will also have Jimmy Moore, who will be joining us, and he will talk to you about the STEM school that he started along with others. And these just amazing young people, some who've come from challenging backgrounds, who when they finish the training course, and you see the Android that they have there, they created that. They also have been trained on windmills, how to build windmills and solar installation. When the kids who go through his program, they are finished, they have the same level of education as a first-year MIT student. And I'll let him break that down for you to really be able to grasp how important this work is, and being able to help these young children and moving into young adulthood to be able to be a part of the new 21st century economy. Next slide. Just a couple of others who will be joining us. I wanted to call out Dinell Wilkins from the Green Door Initiative in Detroit. She has worker training programs, and we'll talk about that as a part of our economic transformations. She has a number of returning citizens who are a part of the folks that she trains. She has one of the highest retention rates in the country of folks getting placed in jobs, and some creating their own businesses. So shout out to Dinell Wilkins. I hope you all will take a look at the Green Door Initiative because it can be a model for the rest of the country. You know, my mom says you have power unless you give it away. We've seen that power play out. We've seen people coming together. You know, there are a lot of divisions and these walls that people will build between each other, between communities. But we've seen power play out. The Women's March was a great example of sisters saying, you know what, we're going to make change happen. We're going to make sure that if we can't find folks who represent us, that we're going to identify individuals to be able to run for office. Even when men said that 1 million women wouldn't come together, sisters proved them wrong. And now when you look at Capitol Hill, when you look in state houses and county commissions across our country, you see so many more women who are helping to make this country better. And some of that action came out of that initial Women's March. And then you see the People's Climate March, and you see the picture of all of these different types of folks and organizations coming together and saying that we can win on climate, but it is going to take to make sure that the front lines and the voices from those communities are helping to lead us in a brighter future, and that we have the opportunity to come together. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about science. I'm also one who has been wedded in science and believes that science plays a critical role in helping to address many of the issues that are going on. And the Science March gave those scientists and analysts an opportunity to come out of those labs and to actually get engaged. And, you know, people said scientists would never show up, but they were wrong. And we understand that there is power in science, but that science also has to honor traditional environmental knowledge from our indigenous brothers and sisters. It also has to honor that wisdom that Mrs. Ramirez has and Mr. Johnson has from their years of living in communities and seeing things transform and change. So when I talk about science, I am talking about all of the various aspects of it coming together and helping to inform policy and helping to make policy stronger and better. Next slide. And we have to also remember that we're going to have to make sure that diversity in all of its forms and fashions is finally honored in the work that happens in outdoor spaces and the work that happens on indoor spaces. And we have to make sure that we are creating safe spaces so that we can have conversations, so that we can make sure that folks are honored and protected and that they know that they are valued. Next slide. And of course, we have to uplift and provide and strengthen platforms and stand in solidarity with the amazing young leaders who are, some are watching, and they are also all across our planet, whether we're talking about folks with the Green New Deal, or This Is 0 Hour, or the HBCU Climate Change Initiative that Dr. Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright and a number of others have been a part of. There are amazing youth leaders all around us, and we have to support them. And we have to make sure that that energy, that innovation, that ingenuity is being supported. And that's why as we move throughout this series, we're going to make sure that that is integrated and uplifted. And we got to also make sure that we give credit to the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Lives Matter marches that happened across our country, because it showed folks that if you were ever, a participant or you were watching closely, that African-American brothers and sisters, and white brothers and sisters, indigenous brothers and sisters, and Latinx brothers and sisters, and Asian and Pacific Islander, and the LGBTQIA family, all coming together to say that injustices that were tolerated or accepted in the 19th century, in the 20th century, will not be a part of the 21st century, because we are willing to get engaged and we are willing to invest our time and our bodies to make sure that our country looks differently and acts differently. And that is the beauty of the Black Lives Matter March. It began to put race right in front of folks to say, this has to change. And we've got tools that are out there. We'll talk about those as we move forward. The Environmental Justice for All Act and a number of other pieces of legislation, both on the federal and the state, and sometimes on the county level, are being introduced or have passed. And those are key pieces of policy that will be necessary for us to achieve many of the goals that we talked about today. Next slide. The Environmental Justice EJ40 initiative, as many speak about it, we're going to unpack that in a few of the different seminars because it runs throughout many aspects of how we make real change happen. And I look forward to very vigorous conversations about that. The difference between benefits and actual real dollars getting into the hands of communities who need them the most. Next slide. And once again, we have to begin to, and we continue to divest from fossil fuels. And a number of different folks have been a part of that. Next slide. Shout out to the Hip Hop Caucus and the Respect My Vote campaign and People's Climate Music, which are two vehicles that have been used to make sure that folks understand that they have power in relationship to the civic process and being able to make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to be able to vote. And we all have seen what's going on in the news today in relationship to that. These are some of the other faces that are making sure the power and culture and collaboration are becoming a reality. Next slide. Next slide. And for me, this is why we do it. We do it for the next generation and for my Indigenous brothers and sisters who have reminded us that we do it for 7 generations to come. These are the ones that we are fighting for. These are the ones that we are trying to make sure that there is a brighter future for. Next slide. So it doesn't matter if it's at the White House or on Capitol Hill or in state houses, inside of corporations or nonprofits, or inside of academic institutions, or inside of our own family conversations sitting around the dinner table. We have to continue to engage with each other. We have to continue to push each other. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we are embracing our humanity and understanding, as Dr. King shared with us, that we may have come to these shores in different ships. We're all in the same boat now. We're in the same boat in relationship to COVID-19 and the pandemic, even though it impacts some communities differently. We're in the same boat in relationship to the climate crisis and environmental injustice. And if we can find ways to have tough conversations, if we can find ways to embrace our humanity and to translate that embracing of our humanity into policies and sets of actions and resources and center that with frontline communities, then we will have found our North Star, and that North Star is justice. I'm Mustafa Santiago Ali. I look forward to our journey over the next few months. And I believe now we may have a couple of questions as we close out.
Yes, hello, Doctor. So Tyler, a student from SBA as well, wants to know if there's still time to do something about climate change and the environment, or how we can get in the right track to, find answers to these problems.
Well, the IPCC and the National Climate Assessment Report share with us, one, how we got to where we are, but two, a set of milestones that we have to meet. If we meet those milestones, then we can mitigate many of the impacts that are happening. We won't be able to fully eliminate all of them, but we can begin to put in place a number of the steps and actions that will be necessary. So the answer is yes. The question is, do we have the will to do what's necessary to be able to address the climate crisis? And each day is important. So we can't wait, the clock is ticking, but we can make some positive change happen.
The next question comes from Iris. Most policies develop over time, meaning they do expire and target the vulnerable and population. So how do we collectively get these threatening social injustices, new improvement policies that don't expire or threaten future generations?
First thing we do is make sure that we all are engaging in the civic process, to make sure that we are voting. I never tell anybody who to vote for, but I do say vote for somebody who cares about your community and vote for somebody who is forward thinking. So that's one of the places. The other part is that we have so many amazing minds who are on today that we continue to look for those policies that have elements that are hurtful, that are not helpful. And we begin to make sure that we are calling those out. And then we begin to work with organizations and individuals to make sure that we are moving forward with sets of recommendations to make sure that whatever future policies have a different flow to them, you know, that they are actually focused on helping to uplift folks and to make sure that their lives are better. I've never understood how we pass a policy that is going to be destructive, that is going to end up costing us more money, that is going to end up leaving people in a more dangerous situation. Each of the young people who are watching today, you have an opportunity to change that dynamic. I hope you realize how much power you actually have, especially when you come together as, you know, as a group, and that group continues to grow out. People will try and, you know, infuse into you that you really don't have that much power. That is a false narrative. We have to change that dynamic.
Those are all the questions we had for today. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate you. And I know that we're going to have, you know, a lot of interesting conversations as we move forward. So thank you all for hanging in there in the framing of the way that we're going to address some of these issues. Everyone stay blessed, and I'll see you at our next event, which will be on February the 17th, honoring Mother Earth, natural solutions to address the climate crisis. And when you look at the first principles of the environmental justice movement, you will see that that one is the first principle.